Make me an instrument of your peace. I'm sure many of you have heard the saying that's been attributed to Pope Paul VI. If you want peace, work for justice. You may wonder why I got involved with this or how I got involved with it. I worked for the Diocese of Gallup for about 20 years. And in part of that time, I implemented a process for conflict resolution using restorative justice. And I received, as part of that, mediation training at Fresno Pacific University. And so restorative justice kind of became a passion for me. I ended up writing my master's thesis on the efficacy of conflict resolution and restorative justice in a Catholic situation. And in the last 6 years of my career, I was the CFO at a federally qualified health center. And we had a pretty significant mental health component. And so I ended up getting trained in nonviolent conflict resolution or nonviolent conflict crisis intervention, which uses many of the same principles in resolving conflict with restorative justice. And then more recently, when we moved here, I've been involved with the Northern Arizona Restorative Justice Project. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that or not, but if I can get through all this at the end, there's a little video that they put together that I'd like to play for us. If you could sum up, I love this picture of St. Francis. You know, most people like the one with the birds and the deer. For some reason, I like this. I think El Greco is the one who painted. If you could sum up our faith in just one word, what would you choose? Love, peace, compassion. There's no wrong answer here. I just like to hear what people say. Anything else? Conversion, forgiveness, faith, listening. Those are all excellent answers. And we look at all of those answers, I think we can see that most of them, if not all of them, point to relationships. Relationship to God or relationship to each other. You know, Jesus said when he was asked, the greatest commandment, love God and then love your neighbor. Our faith is a faith based in relationships. Our God is not a God of laws and regulations. He's a God of personal interaction. And we're very lucky in our faith to have the example of the perfect relationship, which is Trinity. In fact, the Catechism of the Catholic Church says that the real distinction in the persons in the Trinity from one another resides solely in the relationships which relate them to one another. So relationship defines the three persons. It's at the heart and nature of our triune God. And being made in the image and likeness of God, relationship is at the heart of our nature as well. Actually, you can do both of them. One more. We have a great basis for initiating those relationships with both God and each other. And I'm referring to the sacraments. The sacrament particularly of baptism and Eucharist. Baptism incorporates us into the body of Christ. It's a source of unity. And Eucharist enhances that unity, both with Christ and with each other. So if the sacraments initiated us into those relationships, then it's up to us to maintain those relationships peacefully and in a right order. So what's one of the main reasons or causes that keep us from that goal of maintaining right relationships? And I hinted at it earlier. I would say it's conflict. Or not just conflict, but how we resolve conflict. So if relationships are this most important thing, both in our faith and in our nature, then the procedures and the processes and everything we use to resolve conflict ought to aim at strengthening relationships. But I would suggest that what we do is just the opposite. We have many types of policies that are designed to resolve conflict, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. In work or at school, we call them grievance procedures. Or in schools, we refer to them as discipline policies. The basis for all of those is to resolve conflict, to set the ground rules on how we resolve conflict when we have conflict with each other. Let's look at a case in our parish, because we're all familiar with our parishes. Who are the potential people that would have conflicts in a parish? Pastor and anybody. Pastor and a parishioner, not that that ever happens, but yeah. What else? Parish council, okay. If you've got, how about a CCD teacher and a student? Or a CCD teacher and a parent?
Or even Catholic school and CCD.
Catholic school and CCD. Volunteers. Doesn't matter. It's almost part of our fallen human nature that at some point or another, we're going to be in conflict with people. We're going to look at kind of the big picture first. And there are really two types of resolution processes that we can use. The first is retribution-based. And this is probably something that we're very familiar with. It's punitive in nature. It's punishment-based. And in this process, the process of doing it is what's most important. This is what our criminal justice system is based on. And it's so familiar to us that it's really ingrained in our societal values. And the models we use to resolve conflict are probably based on this, whether we realize it or not, whether it's a grievance procedure or a school discipline policy, or how we resolve conflict in our families. But what I'm going to introduce to you today is a process that is restorative in nature. The resolution is based on restorative justice. And in restorative justice, relationships are what's most important. To make things as right as possible when harm is done is what's most important in restorative justice. Everyone has their own preferred technique to deal with conflict. And this is an example of a common technique we may see used. But recognizing that there are different ways to resolve conflict, I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what is it that I normally use to resolve conflict? And there are two instruments that we base most of our resolution techniques on. The first is power or authority. And the second is who's right and who's wrong. We argue the legalities of what happened. And our criminal justice system is certainly based on both of these. When an offense comes before the criminal justice system, we ask ourselves, what law has been violated, who violated it, and what's their punishment? We very rarely care about the victim, and the process is what's most important, and we certainly don't care about the offender. And so to go back to those grievance procedures and discipline policies, all those things we use in our workplace, in our school, even in our family, they're kind of based on that premise. Who broke the rule and what should the punishment be? The problem with both of these whether it's power-based or right and wrong-based, is that there ends up being a winner and a loser. And rarely are relationships addressed. So recognizing that we use these ways of resolving conflict, how do we typically resolve conflict? There's 4 options that I'm going to present here in a graphic model. And the first one, I'm going to explain what these mean. First of all, these vertical lines represent the parties in a conflict. So you always need at least 2 parties. And I guess you could have internal conflict, but I don't want to get it. This could be an individual. It could be a group. It could be nations. There's always got to be 2 parties, maybe more, but at least 2 parties. And then the circle represents who has the power or the authority to resolve the conflict. So in this case, this is model number 1 or option number 1. In this case, one party has the ability to cause the other party to go along with the resolution, even if they don't want to. So one party has all the authority. Can you think of an example?
And the sheriff.
Yeah, it's a good one. You know, if you get pulled over for speeding, the policeman's going to give you a ticket. You don't have any. I mean, you could argue it in court, but you don't have any. Teacher and student. Another good example. A lot of the husband and wife, maybe so. Pastor and parishioner, maybe. You know how to say no to your pastor? Yes, Father. You know, a lot of times supervisor and employee. So this is the first model. The second model is we still have the 2 parties, but the X represents an outside entity. They're not part of the conflict, but they're there, and they're the ones that have the authority or the power to resolve the conflict. How about an example of this? Arbitration.
Siblings and parents.
Possibly, yeah, siblings, that's a good one. You know, this is our criminal justice system. You know, the X could be the judge or the jury. Okay, the 2 parties in the conflict, they don't have any say in the matter. It could be something as simple as, not necessarily a person, but as a rule book. Let's say 2 people are playing chess and one of them says, you know, you can't move that rook that way. And the other one says, well, sure I can. Well, let's resolve it by looking the rule book up, okay? So that's option number 2. Option number 3, we still have the 2 parties. We have an outside entity, but the authority is shared by the parties involved. This is more of a mediation model. And I want to stress that this is not compromise, but it's resolving together. I've unfortunately have been involved over the years several times with mediation in a legal setting. And the mediator that we used several times was fond of starting things off by saying, a successful mediation is one where both parties go home unhappy because they've both given something up. That's not what we're talking about here, okay? It's a very different concept. This type of resolution is where both parties are satisfied. So those are first 3. And the fourth one is where both parties are sharing the authority and there is not an outside party involved at all. when I presented this in a school setting, and of course, they're thinking of the teachers and the students mostly. At some point, a teacher is going to say, well, wait a second, I'm not going to give up my authority to a student or my power. But this is a difference between power over someone and power with someone. So the parties really have to they really have to understand what we're talking about when you enter into this kind of resolution. So we've got these four options. You can show of hands here. If you were involved in a conflict, well, this isn't a show of hands. If you were involved in a conflict, which one of these four options would you rather be using? 1, 2, 3, or 4? 3, 4. Somebody usually says 1 as long as they're the one inside the circle. What options deal mostly with relationships? 4 and 3. I would submit to you that number 1 and number 2 are actually detrimental to relationships. So if we agree that number 3 or 4 are the ones that we'd rather use, the ones that we deal with relationships most, and relationships are critically important to us as human beings, what do we use most often? Probably 1 and 2 is what we use most often. So what other guidance, we may look at this logically and say, yeah, I can see what you're saying. What other guidance do we have? Matthew 18, 15 through 17. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won over your brother. If he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every fact may be established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. You went one too far, but that's okay. If he refuses to listen to them, tell the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, then treat him as you would a Gentile or tax collector. So you can see that in that scripture passage, it's really starting at number 4, and then number 3, and then number 2, and as a last resort, number 1, because you're really ostracizing somebody from the community in a number 1 situation. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a lot of citations that I've used in the past from this, but I'm not going to go through them in detail. Canon law talks about alternative resolution rather than using the canonical legal system. The Catechism of the Catholic Church doesn't mention restorative justice as such, but it certainly talks about having human relationships in harmony. The Sacramental Theology of Penance is a great one, because the sacrament of reconciliation is restorative in nature. It restores us to the church and to each other and to God. It's the whole point of it. Catholic social teaching mentions relationships, social relationships. Vatican II documents, particularly Lumen Gentium, talks about relationships rooted in peace, charity, and justice. Several of the papal encyclicals refer to this. And then U.S. Catholic bishops several years ago, it's probably been about 20 years ago, put out a statement on responsibility, rehabilitation, and restoration, which is all about restoring relationships in the criminal justice system. So we look at this, this could be conflict between individuals, like I said. Could be conflict between parties in a legal or a criminal situation. It could be conflict between nations. doesn't matter how small or how big it is, the same principles in restorative justice can be used for resolution. So if we believe that, or we buy into that this is important, and relationships are so important, both from our faith and in our society, why don't we use number 3 or number 4 often or at all? 4 main reasons that Ron Clausen, who's the one who kind of developed this model, cites is that the first one is that people lack the skills and strategies to do this. If you throw 2 people in a room and say, resolve your conflict, it's going to be more like that cartoon. People need to be educated on how to talk with one another, how to communicate with one another, how to listen to one another in order to resolve a conflict. Come along with this, organizations, they don't have the formal structure in place to do this. They have a grievance policy or a discipline policy at a school. It's more like the criminal justice system. It's just the opposite of this. Who broke the rule and what are we going to do about it? How do they get punished? And along with that is no one ever encourages this. We're so geared towards the other way. And, this is ingrained in our society. A violation of the rule deserves punishment, usually punishment only, but certainly punishment. People who get hurt, they don't want to make nice, they want revenge, or they want to sue, they want punishment. So when we enjoy it in this more traditional model, when a rule is violated, there needs to be consequences. It's focused on retribution and not restoration. It's saying that the punishment fits the crime. That's usually the major involvement is how can we punish people for what they've done? I'll take a little break just to see if anybody's got questions or comments so far.
Well,
Yes, ma'am.
I just, as you're going through this, I'm thinking so much of our Franciscan life, which is really that we should be involved in dialogue. And if we use dialogue as maybe our first step in so many instances, not just conflict, but just in regular communicating of needs and wants and desires, that we already have a beautiful tool.
Yeah.
You go back, can you take us back to the very first slide where you had a stroke and a stroke down?
Yeah, go on. You can use the back button.
If you do the other side? Or let me just say, that first stroke is an I.
Here, whoop, whoop, go back. You can back this one. Go forward. Because they're all there. One more. There we go.
Okay. First stroke, second stroke. You could turn that into cursive I's. I versus I. Visually, a process of conflict resolution arrows down to that circle with the word we.
Very nice.
We are not a we country. Our kind of capitalism is an I kind. If you read Pope Francis's last encyclical, he is defining an economy that is a we, or a capitalism that is a we capitalism. Our country is based on an I capitalistic system. We also, everything we do is about I. It is a counter US culture, public culture, to think we.
And not just from a Franciscan standpoint, but from a Christian standpoint in general. I mean,
Your
we
process-
have so much, yeah.
Your process is the attempt for two I's to become a we on purpose.
Can I use that in the future? I think that fits nicely with that description of the difference between power over and power with. You know, it's the individual as opposed to the we. That's very nice. Thank you.
Just in the sense of conversion to spring off what Pat was saying. And many, in fact, some of us in the room even experienced it when it happened. But we had a lady in formation, and I used to ask at the beginning of the class, you know, well, what has changed for you this month? And, you know, where have you experienced conversion? And so she said one evening at the opening of class, she said, well, for me, she said, I am beginning to change the M to a W. And I had no clue what she was talking about. You know, and I said, well, can you explain that a little bit? And she said, I'm beginning in my life to find out that I am changing the me to a we. And I just think that is so powerful that if the conversion doesn't start with us as an individual, that I can change. It's not about, life is not about me, it's about we. And then the dialogue can take place. And yeah.
May I piggyback on Esther? Yeah, we'll just go somewhere. The conflict resolution that came out of South Africa, when the people who were in power, military and others, had done so many horrible things, and the victims themselves, or the parents of children who had been tortured and murdered, they came and they told their story. They told the pain of their story. It was a catharsis. It cleaned out them, but often the perpetrators were in tears too. And that was also an I to a we, and the cleansing. So we're talking the same talk.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, when we talk about the criminal justice system, that's what we're talking about, is getting the offender and the victim together so that the victim can voice the hurt that they've experienced. And the offender can appreciate the fact that that's happened, and not only appreciate that, but admit their guilt in part of that, which never happens in the criminal justice system, because whoever is charged says what? Not guilty. And then if they ended up getting convicted, that's fine, but they've never, you know, they don't admit that to the victim. And so both of those people suffer, you know, in that situation. You know, I think
to repair the harm that you've done to yourself, and self-identification of harm is very difficult. But once you have identified that, to repair that harm, then to move on to repair the harm to your family and your community is what heals a society.
we can stop that. So I don't know, I know you couldn't hear that, but Amy's going to get that link out to everybody so that if you want to, you know, I've been part of a couple of in the Northern Arizona restorative justice group, they call them restorative justice circles. And I've been a part of a couple of them. That was produced and during the pandemic, but we did have a couple. And they were all with minors.
So let's just start here.
They weren't with adults. And it was a situation where, you know, the offender, the minor who committed the crime, and the parents, and the people that were affected by it, as well as a community member in general, got together to talk about what they did. And then everybody got to express the harm that that caused. You know, the parents were able to tell their child, here's what you did to me by doing that. And a community member was able to talk to that child and say, you know, me as living in this area, you know, this is how that's affected me. And so, yeah, it's all about that relationship, bringing people into relationship with each other, you know, and then the offender gets to,
We done with your phone?
yeah, we're done. And the offender, you know, gets to express, you know, what happened with them and why they did it. And the big part is admitting that they did wrong, which goes a long way towards healing, not only the offender, but the, you know, the people that were involved. So I said that, you know, this, okay. My timekeeper. I mentioned that this is used historically in criminal justice systems, but I hope I've given you kind of an insight on, you know, how to use it in your personal relationships, or to recognize, you know, when you start to be angry at somebody for something, how your instinct to resolve that is, and maybe think about choosing a different way to do it because of how important relationships are. Anybody else with comments or?
I just had it may be a tangent, and I'm not sure if they'll just direct me. But if we look at the church's concept of the incarnation, we kind of have like the atonement, retribution concept, but then as Franciscans, we look at the loving aspect of that. Can you speak a little bit about that, or is this not relatable? That's what was kind of coming in my mind.
Elaborate.
So we have the incarnation as an effect of the sinful people. Like we need to do this to, you know, or that's I'm talking about. Maybe I'm talking about crucifixion, maybe more so. But yeah, we kind of look at this is the loving side of things to do, I guess.
Well, and I guess.
I'm not going to find this person on that.
Yeah. You know, hello. For those of you who didn't hear, you know, Bridget asked about the incarnation and passion and crucifixion, and that atoning for our sins and reconciling us, and maybe contrasting that with the spirit of love that we would identify with the Franciscan community. And I guess what comes to mind is that, you know, the whole incarnation and act of redemption was based in love.
So relationship, yeah.
It may not have been what was used, you know, but that was, love was what brought forth the whole redemptive act.
An example of how the foundational program is based in the juvenile criminal justice system is, what's the creator's name again? The Mennonite.
Oh, Ron Clausen.
Ron Clausen. His wife was a teacher, a classroom teacher. And she took this and created a whole program and implemented it within her school. And she wrote a book about it. So taking the original and then, you know, expanding or figuring out how to use it in other different systems, in different ways. You know, it really can be. It can be used, you know, in a family with a parent and children, a husband and a wife, and she implemented it. And in her book, she talks about the transformation between student and student. When there's a conflict out in the playground, she would bring the students together. It wouldn't be an automatic to the office or an automatic to bring the students together. Of course, the teachers have to be. Everybody has to be trained in this process. But as a former educator, you know, it was enlightening to read and know that this can be powerful in a lot of different systems.
Including the fraternities, you know, for sure.
The other concept that I find that was really not verbalized here, but is very much part of this, is mercy. And I think mercy is something that our Pope certainly talks about a great deal, Pope Francis. And it certainly appears right now that there's not a lot of mercy being shown to our Pope either to him, but he is certainly exhibiting mercy. And I think if we as Franciscans can really keep that in the forefront of our experiences too, the mercy and love of God.
Make me an instrument of your peace. What a better way to do it.
In order for me to do genuine conflict resolution, I must tear apart the protective shell that I have around me that keeps all of my faults inside and my hates and my prejudices. Francis could throw coins to the leper from his horse, but he had to break down that crust around him and get down off the horse and hug the leper. And in that process, his conversion experience is the breaking down of the protective shell and being totally vulnerable to the ugly in self, to the ugly of the other. We cannot have genuine conflict resolution till we have broken down daily that protective shell. And that's why our rule calls us to go out and relate to the marginalized, because we must daily remove the protective shell of prejudice and fear. So we can do conflict resolution. It's very hard to see our ugly and hug others ugly, but that's where it is. That's where the love is.
The parties have to be not only educated, but have to be willing to participate. And in order to do that, everybody's got to give up something of themselves. I did a mediation one time between a principal and a teacher, and it had become an ugly situation. And in the process, I mean, I spent 2 days talking with them individually, talking with them on the phone before they even came together, explaining the process, going over ground rules with them, telling them what to expect. Everybody agreed. We got together. We had about 6 hours worth of dialogue. And at the end, when they were developing a resolution that they were both going to participate in, we got to the point where we actually wrote up a commitment, which is what kind of you do in this process, that they were both going to agree to. And one party said, yeah, no, I don't trust her. And it just fell apart. You know, if people if people aren't going to buy into the process, you can't force them. Yeah, it all fell apart. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.